My father said I didn't belong in his company, so I built my own and took every single one of his clients. There's a quiet weight that settles in your chest when the person who's supposed to believe in you the most looks through you like you're invisible. My name is James, and I'm 29 years old. For as long as I can remember, my father's shadow has loomed over every decision I've made, every hope I dared to hold. Our family, once close-knit, has frayed at the edges over the years, strained by unspoken resentments and expectations that felt more like chains than bonds. Growing up, my father was a titan in the business world, a man who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. I was supposed to be his heir, the one to carry on the legacy. Yet from the moment I expressed even the slightest interest in joining his company, the subtle coldness began. It wasn't loud or dramatic, no raised voices or outright confrontations, just a persistent silence that filled the room whenever I asked questions or tried to prove myself. I could see it in his eyes, a flicker of doubt that burned into me like a quiet accusation. There was a distance that couldn't be bridged, a barrier I couldn't name but felt deeply. At times, I wondered if I was imagining it, that maybe my own insecurities were twisting our interactions into something darker. But the small moments piled up, dismissive glances, the way meetings ended abruptly when I entered, the absence of encouragement when I stumbled. It wasn't just business. It felt personal, like an unspoken verdict that I didn't belong in his world. I carried that unease with me, a gnawing sense of injustice that whispered I was more than what he was willing to see. I never wanted to disappoint him, or to prove him wrong, but somewhere beneath that need, a quiet fire began to grow, a determination to carve out a place where I could stand on my own terms. The path ahead was unclear, but the first step was already forming in my mind, a plan that would change everything between us. What I didn't know then was how far I'd have to go to finally be seen, and how much I would have to take back in the process. In the quiet corners of our home, the distance between my father and me grew wider with each passing day, though no one ever spoke of it aloud. Family dinners, once lively and full of warmth, became exercises in restraint. I learned to sit still, to keep my thoughts to myself, because speaking up only seemed to make the invisible wall thicker. My mother tried to bridge the gap when she could, but even her gentle efforts often met with curt nods or distracted glances from my father. It felt as though I was a ghost at the table, present but unseen. At work, the pattern was even more pronounced. I would arrive early, eager to learn, to contribute, to be noticed. But meetings were often closed doors when I approached, my input brushed aside with a polite but firm dismissal. I remember one particular afternoon when I stayed late, poring over a proposal I hoped would impress him. When I finally presented it, hoping to break through the coldness, he barely glanced at the pages before setting them aside. The silence that followed was heavier than any criticism. It was a void that swallowed my efforts whole. I found myself replaying those moments over and over, trying to rationalize his behavior. Maybe he was stressed, burdened by the weight of the company. Maybe he thought I was too inexperienced, too naive. I told myself that patience was a virtue, that the bond between father and son was stronger than these silent battles. I clung to the hope that if I just worked harder, stayed quieter, proved myself in time, he would finally see me, not as a disappointment, but as a partner. But the emotional toll was undeniable. Nights grew restless as doubts crowded my mind, and mornings came with a tightness in my chest I couldn't shake. I began to shrink inside, dimming my own light to avoid the sting of rejection. The love I longed for felt like an echo bouncing off walls I couldn't break through. Still, I waited, silently hoping for a sign that I belonged. Yet, beneath that waiting, something was shifting, subtle but unmistakable. The quiet acceptance I had wrapped myself in was starting to unravel, replaced by a new awareness that maybe, just maybe, the place I sought wasn't the one I'd been trying to fit into all along. One afternoon, the kind that starts ordinary but unfolds into something I couldn't unsee, I found myself lingering in the office longer than usual. The sky outside had turned a dull gray, rain tapping softly against the windows, a quiet soundtrack to the storm brewing inside me. I was organizing some files when the muffled voices drifted down the hall, a conversation that wasn't meant for my ears. Curiosity pulled me toward the doorway, where the door was cracked just enough for me to catch fragments. My father's voice, sharp and clipped, carried through the silence. "James is a liability," he said, cold and final. Another voice, one I recognized as the CFO's, nodded. "He's not ready. He doesn't understand our clients or the stakes." I froze, heart pounding in a rhythm that felt like a warning bell. Liability. The word echoed in my mind, dragging with it a heavy weight I hadn't fully acknowledged before. They weren't just doubting me behind my back. They were dismissing me as a burden, a risk to everything my father had built. This wasn't about concern or caution. It was about rejection, plain and brutal. A part of me wanted to bolt, to retreat into the safety of silence and shadows. But another part, raw and aching, stayed rooted to the spot, absorbing the sting of their verdict. I could feel the slow burn of tears behind my eyes, but I blinked them away fiercely. This wasn't about weakness. It was about clarity. I hadn't imagined the distance between us. It wasn't some invisible wall that might someday come down. It was a chasm, carved by deliberate choices and quiet condemnations. The man who was supposed to be my greatest supporter saw me as an obstacle, a threat to his empire, and he had quietly aligned others to believe the same. That night, as the rain drummed relentlessly on the roof, I sat alone in my small apartment, the weight of that conversation pressing down like a physical force. The silence was no longer empty. It was a verdict rendered in shadows. I replayed every interaction, every cold glance, every dismissed idea. They weren't mistakes or misunderstandings. They were the truth I had feared but never wanted to face. And yet, beneath the hurt, beneath the shock, something unexpected flickered, an ember of fierce resolve. If I was a liability in his eyes, then I would stop asking for his approval. If I was seen as a threat, then I would become one on my own terms. The path I had once hoped to walk alongside him was closed. But maybe that path was never mine to take. I realized then that belonging wasn't about fitting into his world. It was about building a world where I could belong without apology. And with that realization came a quiet, unshakable decision. I wouldn't just walk away. I would rise. I would take everything he thought I couldn't have. That night, something inside me shifted irrevocably. The boy who once sought his father's approval began to fade, replaced by a man who understood the cost of being invisible and the power of being seen on his own terms. That night, after the rain had finally softened to a hush, I found myself standing at the threshold of my father's house. The familiar porch light cast long shadows across the stoop, flickering faintly as a breeze stirred the leaves nearby. I didn't know exactly what was pushing me out the door. Maybe it was the weight of that damning word, liability, or the relentless ache of being unseen. But whatever it was, I couldn't stay inside the walls that had begun to feel like a cage. I stepped quietly into the darkness, the cool night air wrapping around me like a fragile shield. The world outside felt vast and indifferent, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't have to carry the suffocating burden of expectation. As I walked down the street, the distant hum of city life buzzed softly. Life was moving forward, indifferent to my silent rebellion. The streetlights blurred through the mist, casting a muted glow that felt less like illumination and more like a gentle invitation to vanish. My heart was a tangled mess, heavy with sorrow, yet strangely unshackled. I thought about the years I had spent shrinking myself into the shape my father wanted, trying to fit into a mold that never quite fit. I thought about the countless moments I had silenced my voice, swallowed my dreams, and folded my identity beneath the weight of his disapproval. Now, under the cover of night, I realized I was done shrinking. Walking felt like shedding layers, each step a quiet break from the past. I wasn't running away, not really. It was more like stepping aside, reclaiming a space that had been denied to me for too long. I let my hands fall loose at my sides, no longer clenched tight with frustration or longing. The sting of rejection still lingered, but it was now accompanied by something unfamiliar, a fragile sense of freedom. I thought about my mother's quiet attempts to mend the fractures between us, and a pang of guilt gnawed at me. Had I been too silent, too patient? Could I have spoken louder or pushed harder? But those questions felt distant, like echoes from another life. Tonight was about something new, something tender and tentative. It was about choosing myself, even if that choice meant stepping away from the familiar warmth of family, from a legacy I was never truly part of. I found a bench beneath a solitary oak, its branches swaying gently above me. Sitting there, I allowed myself to breathe without the weight of judgment pressing down. There was sadness, yes, a deep, aching ache for what could have been, but also a quiet resolve that hummed beneath the surface like a low, steady drumbeat. This was the moment I stopped waiting for permission to exist, the moment I stopped hoping to be accepted on someone else's terms. In that stillness, I made a silent promise. I would build my own path, not out of spite, but out of necessity. Not to break him, but to break free. The night stretched out before me, vast and unknowable, but for the first time, it felt like mine to navigate. I stood, the weight inside me shifting from burden to possibility, and I walked away, not lost, but choosing distance, not defeated, but quietly beginning to rise. The next morning, as sunlight filtered through my blinds, I found myself scrolling aimlessly through my phone, a restless energy buzzing beneath my skin. Then, almost by chance, I stumbled upon a podcast episode titled, "Building Your Own Empire: Stories of Reinvention." The speaker's voice was calm, but charged with conviction, sharing tales of people who had broken free from toxic expectations to create something uniquely theirs. A spark flickered in my chest. I wasn't alone in this. Later that day, I reached out to an old college friend, Rachel, someone I hadn't seen in years but who had always believed in my potential. We met at a small cafe, the kind of place where the hum of conversation blends with the scent of fresh coffee and the promise of new beginnings. Her eyes lit up when I told her everything: the rejection, the silent battles, the growing need to escape the shadow that had suffocated me for so long. Rachel didn't offer empty reassurances or quick fixes. Instead, she listened, really listened, and then asked questions that cut through my fog of doubt. What do you want your legacy to be? Not your father's, but yours. What kind of company would feel like home, not a prison? Her words unsettled me at first, but also opened a door I hadn't dared to approach. It wasn't about proving him wrong anymore. It was about proving to myself that I could build something authentic, something that mattered on my own terms. That conversation planted a seed of clarity. For the first time, I began sketching out ideas, not for the business my father wanted me to run, but for one I was passionate about, a firm that valued relationships over transactions, creativity over conformity, and integrity over legacy. I felt a flicker of excitement that I hadn't experienced in years, a tiny ember amidst the ashes of my old self. But more than the business idea, it was Rachel's unwavering belief in me that shifted something inside. Here was someone who saw my worth without reservation, who refused to let me settle for the margins of my own story. Her faith was a mirror reflecting a version of myself I had nearly forgotten. The James who dared to dream, to challenge, to rise. That night, as I lay awake, I realized something profound. The power to redefine my path wasn't just about creating a company or winning clients. It was about reclaiming my voice, my identity, and my right to belong somewhere on my own terms. The anger and hurt still lingered, but beneath them, a new strength was growing, quiet, steady, and relentless. I knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. There would be setbacks, doubts, and moments when the past threatened to pull me back into its shadow. But now, I was no longer waiting for an invitation or battling to fit in. I was ready to step forward and make my own space in this world, even if it meant breaking every expectation I'd ever known. Something inside me had shifted irreversibly. The boy who once sought approval was fading, replaced by a man determined to write his own story. I didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time in a long time, I felt the stirring of hope, a quiet promise that things were about to change, and I was ready to lead that change. Some nights, when the world falls quiet and the weight of everything I'm trying to build presses down, I find myself caught in a tangle of contradictions. I sit alone in my apartment, the walls holding the echoes of 1,000 unspoken words, and I wonder if I'm doing the right thing, or if I'm just chasing shadows of resentment that will never fade. It's strange, this mix of hope and hesitation, pride and aching doubt. I'm forging a new path, yes, But beneath that determination lies a restless heart that still aches for something I can't quite name. I remember a moment from years ago, one I never truly understood until now. I was a kid, sitting beside my father on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. He was quiet that evening, his usual sternness softened by the fading light. I asked him if he was proud of me, not with words, but with that simple, hopeful glance. He looked away, then back, his eyes narrowing as if weighing the truth of my question. He didn't answer, and the silence stretched between us like a canyon. Back then, I took it as rejection, as proof I'd never measure up. But now, I wonder if it was more complicated, if he was wrestling with his own fears, his own disappointments. Maybe he wasn't ready to be proud because he was afraid what pride might mean, letting go of expectations or facing the possibility that I might not follow the path he'd laid out. That thought doesn't erase the hurt, but it softens it too. It reminds me that people are tangled up in their own stories, their own struggles, and sometimes love looks different than we expect. I'm still learning how to hold that complexity without losing myself in it. There are nights when the loneliness sneaks in like a thief, stealing the quiet confidence I try to wear. I question whether stepping out on my own was an act of courage or simply defiance born from pain. Was I running from something or toward something? And if I'm honest, I fear losing more than just my father's approval. I fear losing the family I thought I had, the history that shaped me, even if it was fractured. That fear sometimes whispers that this rebellion might leave me isolated, standing on ground too shaky to hold me. Yet, amidst the swirling doubts, there's a fragile thread of understanding weaving through my thoughts. I realize that the version of belonging I sought so desperately wasn't a place or a title. It was connection, acceptance, unconditional presence. And while I may be building my own company now, what I really need to build is a home within myself, a place where I can hold all the messy parts, the hope, the grief, the anger, and the love, and still stand whole. I don't have all the answers. I don't know exactly where this journey will take me or what I'll lose or gain along the way. But I'm beginning to accept that's okay. That maybe it's not about fixing what was broken or filling every empty space with certainty. Maybe it's about carrying the contradictions, the scars and the dreams, side by side, and learning to be gentle with the man I'm becoming. So tonight, as I let the quiet settle around me, I stop circling the old pain. Instead, I hold it close, not as a wound to be hidden, but as a part of my story that shapes the steps I'm ready to take. And in that moment, I find a small peace, a beginning not of certainty, but of acceptance. That afternoon, the phone rang sharp and sudden, slicing through the quiet I'd been trying to build around myself. The voice on the other end wasn't just unfamiliar. It carried a weight that made my stomach twist. It was my father's lawyer, cold and clipped. "We need to talk about your new company's clients," she said. "There are concerns about breach of contract and potential poaching. If this escalates, it could get messy." My grip tightened around the receiver, heart pounding like a warning drum. I'd expected resistance, maybe anger, but legal threats. The line between personal and professional was dissolving faster than I could process. It wasn't just silent disapproval anymore. It was a calculated move to corner me, to cut off any chance of building what I'd dared to dream. The room seemed to close in, the walls pressing against my chest. I wanted to yell, to explain, to make them see that I wasn't the enemy. But the only sound I made was a strangled breath, swallowed by the weight of their attack. This wasn't about fairness, it was about power, control, and a desperate attempt to keep me invisible. Later that day, I faced my first real confrontation with one of my father's longtime clients. The meeting was tense, the air thick with unspoken accusations. His eyes flicked to the door more than once, as if expecting my father to storm in and shut me down. When he finally spoke, his words had the sting of betrayal. "I don't know if this is the right move, James. Loyalty runs deep here. Your father built this with his hands." I clenched my fists under the table, swallowing the flood of emotion that threatened to spill. This wasn't just business. It was a battlefield where my past and present collided violently. The client's hesitation wasn't just about contracts. It was about trust, history, and the invisible chains I'd spent years trying to break. Walking out of that meeting, I felt the cold slap of reality hit harder than ever. The fight wasn't just about clients or contracts. It was about survival in a world that wasn't ready to see me as anything but a threat. Every step forward was met with resistance, every success shadowed by a looming threat. But beneath that resistance, something fierce ignited. I wasn't here to be a footnote in my father's story. This legal shadow, the cold eyes of clients torn between loyalty and change, it all sharpened my resolve. The path ahead was dangerous, uncertain, and lined with enemies disguised as family. That night, I stared at the ceiling, the weight of the day pressing down like a storm about to break. The crossroads was no longer a distant idea. It was here, demanding a choice. Retreat into silence and safety, or fight with everything I had, even if it meant shattering what was left of my family. The line had been crossed. There was no turning back now. The morning after the lawyer's call, I found myself standing in front of the glass doors of my father's company. Only this time, not as the eager son hoping for a place, but as someone who had finally decided to step beyond the shadows. The weight of what lay ahead pressed on me, but beneath it all was a quiet certainty that had been growing, steady and unyielding. I asked to meet with my father, not to plead or explain, but to lay everything bare, no more silence, no more half-truths. When he arrived, his expression was unreadable, a mask I'd known too well. The office felt smaller than ever, the walls closing in as the conversation began. I spoke calmly, each word deliberate, carrying the weight of years spent wrestling with disappointment and hope. "I'm done waiting for your approval," I said, my voice steady despite the storm beneath. "This company I'm building, it's not a betrayal. It's my life, my choice, and I'm not going to shrink or step aside anymore." He didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched, heavy and sharp, but I held my ground. I could see the flicker of something behind his eyes, surprise, maybe even a grudging respect, but I didn't wait for validation. This was my declaration, not a request. "I know you see me as a threat," I continued, "but I'm not here to take from you. I'm here to stand alongside you, on my own terms. If that's impossible, then I accept that, but I won't let that stop me from building my own path." There was no room for argument, no space for old wounds to be reopened. This was a boundary drawn not in anger, but in clarity. It was a moment where the boy who once sought approval finally stepped into the man who claimed his own space, regardless of the cost. Leaving the office, I felt the weight begin to lift. Not because the future was suddenly lighter, but because I had stopped carrying the burden of someone else's expectations. The cost was real. Fractured ties, quiet hearts left behind. But the price was worth the freedom I'd claimed. I don't need his permission anymore. I am enough, on my own terms, in my own story. The days following that conversation felt strangely quiet, as if the storm inside me had finally spent its fury and left behind a calm, tentative stillness. I moved into a small apartment not far from the heart of the city. A space that wasn't grand or polished but felt like a blank canvas. A place free from the echoes of old expectations and the weight of a legacy I hadn't chosen. The walls were bare, the shelves sparse, but every small corner held a promise of something unfolding slowly, deliberately. Morning light filtered through thin curtains that I hadn't yet bothered to replace, and I found myself lingering by the window with a cup of coffee, watching the world stir awake. The rhythm of this new life was different, less urgent, less burdened by the need to prove or please. I was learning to breathe in moments rather than chase after them, to find steadiness in routines that honored my own pace. Simple things began to matter. The way sunlight caught the edges of a leaf, the quiet hum of the city waking, the soft creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. Emotionally, I was a tangle of contradictions. Relief washed over me in waves, a soothing balm to years of tension and silent struggle. Yet beneath that relief was a profound exhaustion, like my soul had run a marathon it didn't sign up for. Some nights, I felt numb, as if detaching from the past meant shutting down parts of myself that had been bruised and battered. But in those quiet, numb moments, a quiet empowerment simmered, an awareness that I was no longer defined by someone else's narrative. I was here, whole and imperfect, carving out a space that was mine. The phone rang a few times in the weeks after our final meeting. It was my father. Sometimes his voice was hesitant, other times terse, but always carrying that weight of unspoken things. I answered once, then twice, each time keeping my tone calm and steady, neither closing the door nor inviting it wide open. I explained gently that my path was set, that while I respected the history we shared, I needed to live without the shadows of old grievances. There were no apologies, no demands, just clear boundaries drawn with care and resolve. The calls eventually tapered off, the silence settling into a new kind of distance that felt less like loss and more like protection. In this new chapter, I found solace in small rituals that grounded me. I began journaling each morning, not as a task, but as a conversation with myself, a way to hold my thoughts without judgment, to trace the contours of who I was becoming. I made a habit of cooking simple meals, savoring the act of nourishing my body after years of neglecting my own needs in favor of others' expectations. Weekends were marked by solitary walks through the park, where I let the rhythm of my steps sync with the steady pulse of life around me. A quiet communion that reminded me I was part of something larger, even if my place within it was newly claimed. I reconnected with Rachel, the friend who'd once sparked the first ember of belief. Our conversations were no longer about strategy or validation, but about the everyday, about laughter and music, and the small victories that often go unnoticed. Her presence was a reminder that belonging doesn't have to come from legacy or blood. It can be chosen, nurtured, and cherished in friendships that honor the whole person. There was no rush to rebuild, no grand declarations or sweeping gestures. This was about steady steps, about learning to hold my own weight without the crutch of approval or the drag of resentment. It was about honoring the distance between me and my father, not as a battlefield, but as a necessary space where healing might someday take root. Sometimes, late at night, I'd pause and reflect on the fragments of my old life, not with bitterness but with a quiet acceptance. The past was a chapter closed, a story that had shaped me but no longer defined me. In its place, a new narrative was beginning, one written in the language of self-respect, quiet strength, and the freedom to build something that belonged solely to me. And as I settled into this emerging identity, I knew one thing with clarity. I was no longer walking in anyone's shadow. I was forging my own light, and this time, I would carry it on my own terms. Now, sitting here in the quiet of my own space, I look back on everything with a kind of steady stillness that I never thought I'd find. The years of tension, the silent distances, the battles fought mostly in shadows. They no longer sting with the sharpness they once did. Instead, they feel like pieces of a larger puzzle, fragments that shaped me but no longer define me. I've come to understand that some wounds don't heal by closing neatly, but by weaving themselves into the fabric of who we become, softening edges rather than erasing the scars. What I've learned is this: belonging isn't granted by others, nor is it won through approval or inheritance. It's something you build quietly, with patience and honesty, often in solitude. It's less about fitting into a mold and more about embracing the shape you naturally take, even if that shape disrupts expectations. I've let go of the need to rewrite the past or to make sense of every cold glance and every word left unspoken. Those moments are part of the story, but they no longer hold power over my present. There's a freedom I never imagined before, the permission to be imperfect, to stumble, and to grow without the weight of someone else's judgment pressing down. That freedom is both fragile and fierce, a delicate balance I'm still learning to maintain. It means accepting that some relationships change or fade, not because we stopped caring, but because the space between us became too wide to cross without losing ourselves. I carry no bitterness toward my father now. Instead, there's a quiet compassion for the man I once longed to hear say, "I'm proud of you." I recognize that he was caught in his own patterns, his own fears, just as I was in mine. Understanding that has not erased the pain, but it has made room for peace, a peace that doesn't depend on reconciliation, but on acceptance. In moments of stillness, I often think about the small victories that have come from walking this path alone. The first client who believed in my vision, the friend who reminded me of my worth, the mornings when I wake up without the weight of doubt sitting heavy on my chest. These are the quiet gifts that remind me why I chose this journey, why I had to step away from what was familiar to find what was real. If there's one truth I want to hold on to and share, it's this: your value isn't measured by the approval you receive or the legacy you inherit. It's found in the courage to claim your own story, to stand in your own light, even when that light feels small or uncertain. And sometimes, that means walking away, not out of anger or defeat, but out of love for yourself and the life you deserve. To anyone who's ever felt unseen or unheard, I hope you find the strength to build your own space where you can be known and accepted. It's not an easy path, and it isn't always clear, but it's worth every step. Trust in your own resilience, and let your story unfold on your own terms. If this story has touched something in you, or if you know someone who might need to hear these words, I invite you to share it gently. And if you feel moved to stay connected, subscribing and liking the video helps us continue sharing these honest, human stories together. Thank you for listening, for holding space with me. And as I close this chapter, I do so with a quiet heart, ready to meet whatever comes next with openness and grace.